the penultimate session of this Anti-Colonialism and its Afterlives conference. The final session will be back in the, can you hear me now? Yeah, the final session will be back in the Bull Conference Room in 16th Street, followed by the reception. But it was imperative that we hosted this particular session here at the encampment because this session is on Palestine and Israel. Now, ideally I would just introduce the speaker and then let them get on with it, but I think this particular panel warrants a little bit of a longer introduction. When Carlos, Luis, Jochen and I began talking about this conference, it was in September. We had, as we were beginning to kind of conceptualize the thematic of the conference around anti-colonialism, October 7 happened, and then Israel's war on Gaza began. So it became clear to us that we had to have a panel on this particular topic because, in a fundamental sense, the Palestinian question became the paradigmatic expression of the colonial question. But that was very difficult to do precisely because the scholars we reached out to, almost all of them were mostly scholars of Palestine, but specifically the Palestinian scholars were overextended, emotionally under duress, and morally, ethically deconstructed. So we were very lucky to have Dirk Moses and Nadia Goel-Haj agree to speak, but given the recent events at Columbia, Nadia had to withdraw her participation. But nonetheless, we were very lucky to still have Dirk here. Now, in lieu of Nadia's presentation, Dirk will be giving sort of an extended lecture, which is going to last for about 50 minutes. So let me just introduce Dirk. Professor Dirk Moses is the Anne and Bernard Spitzer Professor of Political Science at the City College of New York. He researches different aspects of genocide. He's the senior editor of the Journal of Genocide Research. He is the author of German Intellectuals in the Nazi Past, 2007, and The Problems of Genocide, Permanent Security and the Language of Transgression, 2021. He has also edited several anthologies on the relationship of colonialism and genocide, Genocide and Settler Society, 2004, Colonialism and Genocide, 2007, and Empire, Colony, Genocide, Conquest, Occupation, and Subaltern Resistance in World History, 2008. So, Dirk, please take the floor. I get 15 minutes, and then we'll open up for
Many thanks to the organizers for the invitation to this important conference. I also appreciate their gesture of embedding this panel in the New School encampment, which takes the conference theme of anti-colonialism and its afterlives, renewing and rethinking debates, from the realm of a solely academic event into one of practical reflection. Here is an opportunity for an urgent political question to be considered in light of academic scholarship, because we are, after all, conducting proceedings in a university setting as members of various scholarly communities. But on this occasion, doing so in a dialogue with committed advocacy. There is, I am assured, plenty of time for discussion, even though I'm going to speak for quite a long time. I've just returned from the University of Pennsylvania, where I was at another conference, so I had the opportunity to witness its encampment. Students were sitting in and around their tents, keeping to themselves, their banners doing to the talking. Here are some images. Somehow the one on the left is sideways. This is the different angles of the Benjamin Franklin statue that stands before the imposing College Hall building. You'll see that posters and banners and a keffiyeh adorn him. This is now the back of it. And then on the right is an image of the encampment, and you can see its posters. Occupation is the source of violence, and the occupation at the top, stop killing, stop the massacre of Palestinians, stop the killing of children. So these are images I took on Friday morning. 3 nights ago, the administration sent a message to the Penn community, and I quote it, I was sent a copy. I quote it now, "The harassing and intimidating comments and actions by some of the protesters, which were reported and documented by many in our community, violates PEN's open expression guidelines and state and federal law, including Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. All members of our community deserve to access our facilities without fear of harassment or being subjected to discriminatory comments or threats. The vandalism of the statue in front of College Hall with anti-Semitic graffiti was especially reprehensible and will be investigated as a hate crime." Although there's actually no graffiti, there's just posters stuck on it. There's no, spray paint or anything like that. Now, I don't see anti-Semitic graffiti of the statue, and yet, as on other campuses, such allegations are being weaponized to trigger intense state coercion against peaceful students protesting. Among other things, the mass killing of tens of thousands of Palestinians and the implication of their universities in this killing. I've been shocked how extensive and effective the demonization is, especially as someone who has visited the Columbia campus almost daily to witness developments there. The mainstream media that I've seen has repeated frankly demagogic talking points, inverting reality in a deeply disturbing Orwellian manner, denouncing students as outside agitators and as terrorism supporters because of a few isolated incidents, all while students engage in non-violent demonstration and celebrate interfaith religious ceremonies. From what I've seen and read about the Columbia encampment, the students are also engaging in a remarkable utopian experiment of coexistence that respects and honors religious difference while embedded in a unity based on universal principles of human rights and dignity. They could be at least listened to and their demands discussed rationally. Why should universities invest in arms industries in view of their stated humanistic mission, after all? Instead of dialogue, however, we see the positioning of snipers, yes, snipers, on 2 university campuses, and the deployment of police and troopers in riot gear, meaning pepper spray, batons and shields, against defenseless undergraduates and some professors trying to protect them. These circumstances raise issues apart from the war on Gaza, namely the integrity of the mainstream US media, the authorities' recourse to violence, with the cynical invocations of safety and anti-discrimination rhetoric, the flagrant violation of free speech norms by those who, until the question of Palestine arises, insist on them as the fundament of liberal society. We are observing, I think, a concerted and concentrated episode of liberal governance morphing into authoritarian domination, as the Western claims to superior civilization is increasingly revealed as a conceit by the benign challenge of 1,000 or so US college students out of a population of 300 million. Liberal value after liberal value, including international law and the much prized rules international order, which we heard constantly in relation to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is being jettisoned to protect material and symbolic investments in the Middle East status quo, which includes many Arab regimes, because the students are asking hard questions, obvious questions, about the conditions of freedom and prosperity for some at the expense of others. Above all, as in the Vietnam War protests when their parents were born, students want the killing to stop and to commence discussions about a genuine common life that is not based on fear and domination, but on equality and dignity. The impression is impossible to ignore that the moral panic about student encampments serves not only to distract from the all too real destruction of Palestinian peoples and institutions, like all the universities in Gaza, in addition to scandals like the unearthing of hundreds of Palestinian bodies, some seemingly handcuffed, in a mass grave in the Nasser hospital at Khan Yunis. It is also enabling these destructive practices. Particularly in regard to the mass grave, the contrast to the justifiable horror about the Russian executions in Bucha that emerged exactly 2 years ago in April 22 is also impossible to ignore. Now, the conference abstract states that it aims to broaden the intellectual and political criticism of anti-colonial modernity by exploring, through divergent perspectives, these issues and treating various topics, including Palestine and Israel, as we heard. The invitation mentions the key words of academic anti-colonial analysis, specifically post-colonial, decolonial, settler colonial, and anti-colonial perspectives. That's a quote. And it questions whether they are indeed now spent, that is, exhausted with little more to offer, perhaps in part because post-colonial regimes mobilize these terms in oppressing their own populations, or at least parts of them. In inviting me to this conference, I'm assuming that the conference organizers want me to include genocide in this mix of keywords of anti-colonial modernity, given that what I write about, and then do so in relation to Palestine and Israel. Now, when the invitation was issued, so November last year, none of us, I'm sure, realized how urgent the topic would become. What's more, the conference coincides with the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, the annual anniversary of the Armenian genocide, and the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the Journal of Genocide Research, which, as Udeepta mentioned, I have edited for the last 12 years, and I've worked at it since 2005. The subject could not be more timely in these respects as well. Regrettably, as we've heard, Professor Nadi Abu El-Haj, who is actually a Palestinian scholar and of it, Palestine and Israel, cannot join us, and we've been in touch. We know one another. She sends her regrets. So it's fallen to me less to fill her unfillable shoes than to venture some thoughts on these issues for our discussion. In case you missed it, she's just given a powerful interview in the New Review of Books on the situation at Columbia, dispelling many illusions and concluding that, and I quote her, "Even if you don't agree with the students' politics, you need to recognize that this is a serious political movement and that they're doing an awfully good job. It's a generation that understands the genocide in Gaza as the great moral crisis of our time." End of quote. Now, as you can see from the program, my title is Genocide an Anti-Colonial Concept in Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel, which I came up with in late November last year when the invitation was issued. By then, the claim that Israel was committing genocide was already well established. Okay. Something stuck here. Okay. So it's missed a slide, it doesn't matter. Some in the fields of genocide studies made the claim, and I had some screenshots of that effect, only 6 days after the 7th of October, so on the 13th. Then Palestinian and the International Legal Committee, the TWAIL one here on the top left, issued similar statements, and you see the bottom one's dated the 16th of October, so like 9 days after the 7th. And increasingly, members of other communities, including Jewish Voices, were claiming that genocide was imminent, if not underway. I myself wrote an essay on the subject in late October, so just a few weeks afterwards, but was eventually published after some delays in mid-November, there we go, under the title of More Than Genocide in the Boston Review. It argued, among other things, that the violence we are witnessing in Gaza was best contextualized as a colonial reprisal that have marked imperial history for centuries. Such reprisals, in other words, disproportionate mass violence, won powerful empires for Western states since the 16th century. Indeed, imperial expansion could not have proceeded without these reprisals. But the genocide concept, as formulated in law, could not capture all this violence. And I concluded thus, and this is now a quote from the article, regardless of any legal question of genocide, Israel's supporters find themselves tacitly condoning the ongoing slaughter of thousands of Palestinian civilians. A considerable proportion of their publics, Western publics, understandably reject this outrageous state of affairs. They are unimpressed by legal hair-splitting about the convention, the Genocide Convention's requirements that people are killed as such, meaning solely on the grounds of their identity, the genocidal intent of destroying an enemy, rather than by the military logic of defeating them. For the fact is that whether Israel is committing genocide or erecting a new iron wall of defense, masses of Palestinians are being killed and possibly expelled. It is a distinction without difference for the victims. Seen in this light, the quotation continues, the protest movement's allegations of genocide can be understood as, quote, a symptom of the utter failure of international law in responding to war crimes and crimes against humanity, including apartheid, as the Israeli legal scholar Itamar Man observed in a blog a few days earlier. The claim also reflects the truth, this is my words now, the truth of the victim's perspective. Since genocide is a synonym for the destruction of peoples, whether the killing or suppression of their culture is motivated by destruction as such, or by deterrence, the experience is the same, a destructive attack on a people and not just random civilians. But the Genocide Convention does not reflect the victim's perspective. It protects the perpetrators, states that seek permanent security. I conclude. Now, in response, the anthropologist and legal scholar at the University of Chicago, Darrell Lee, wrote an article in Dissent, and it's screenshotted beneath mine, taking issue with this line of reasoning. Now I'm going to quote a slab of it as well. And now these are his words. As the notion that genocide may be committing genocide, Israel might be committing genocide, and this is from January now, has gained wide traction, a slew of articles have pondered whether the genocide concept still has any utility at all. Even Moses, writing in the Boston Review, could not help but faintly dismiss protesters as merely channeling the truth of the victim's perspective in their quixotic attempts to get the law on their side. Whether these critiques, and especially Moses's, are hardly wild, they are hardly framed as defenses of Israel's actions. Their prominence at this particular moment is, to put it mildly, not inconvenient for Israel. These pieces, he gestures, these pieces which are skeptical of the concept of genocide, gesture to a future in which the powerful decide that if they can't control the use of a word like genocide, they shouldn't use it at all. In such a future, perhaps we could find new ways of understanding and responding to oppression that avoids reliance on spurious hierarchies of suffering. But the road to this goal likely runs not through improved legal definitions for mass atrocity, which is what I was promoting, but through actually existing struggles for justice. Palestinians and their allies who have taken up the demand to stop the genocide are not cheapening the term, he said. On the contrary, they are democratizing its power, extricating genocide from a desiccated legalism that serves the status quo, and injecting it with an explicitly anti-colonial politics instead. Palestinians, like other colonized people, have long narrated their own experience of mass violence with reference to genocide. And this isn't the first time such charges have gained widespread international recognition. The UN General Assembly recognized in 1982 the Israeli-sponsored massacre of Palestinian refugees in Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon as an act of genocide. This history is part of the backdrop of South Africa's legal intervention, Darrell continues. These anti-colonial forces are not uttering genocide as a code word to radio in airstrikes. Here he is sort of mocking Libya and the Western humanitarian interventions. They are naming Western, especially US, complicity with genocide. Instead of using the term to short-circuit political thinking, here the demand to end genocide is merely one component of a broader Palestinian struggle for freedom and self-determination. End of quote. So you can see that Darrell is arguing that genocide can and should be an anti-colonial concept in law for Palestinians. And it's evident that I think many agree with him. To consider this proposition is the aim of my paper this afternoon. First, a few clarifications. I, of course, was not arguing that the Palestinian use of genocide cheapens the term, and Darrell knows this, so I was a bit perplexed to read this, nor maintaining that the victim's perspective on genocide articulates some private truth. The argument is rather that the victims enjoy an epistemological privilege, a particular insight. If genocide is a synonym for the destruction of nations or a people as originally conceived by Raphael Lemkin, during the Second World War, and we'll get to that. Palestinians and their advocates, which I observe include Jewish allies like Jewish Voices for Peace, are reminding everyone of genocide's original meaning, its anti-colonial meaning, and we'll get to this shortly. Now, in my presentation, I'm not going to argue that genocide is or is not a useful anti-colonial strategy or slogan. Instead, I'm going to present A, a history of the term, and B, its use in national liberation struggles in order to provide an archive for the strategic choice-making of maybe some people in this room. I'm not here to tell anyone what to think or what to do. The history I will now relate shows how genocide was originally formulated as an anti-colonial and anti-imperial concept, as Lemkin created it to capture the radicality of the Nazi occupation of Europe. For him, genocide was what he called a technique of occupation. But his very broad anti-colonial definition was stripped away at the United Nations when genocide was formulated in law just a few years later, in late 1948. This new, narrow, and state-friendly definition is what the International Criminal Court and what the International Court of Justice now follow. Now, for those of us finishing our PhDs 25 years ago who are interested in these issues, the field of Holocaust and genocide studies was hopelessly Eurocentric. An intense debate about Holocaust uniqueness had been underway for about 20 years by then, and the focus was very much on Europe, beginning with the Armenian genocide, if you include Greater Eurasia as part of Europe, running through Soviet crimes in the 20s and 30s, the Holocaust, of course, and then ending up with Bosnia in the early 90s, or throughout the 90s. The genocidal massacre of Srebrenica had occurred while I was in graduate school at UC Berkeley. And so it was something we really registered in real time. And yes, of course, genocides had occurred elsewhere, like in Cambodia and in Rwanda, perhaps Darfur, but its archetype was the Holocaust. Completely missing from the field of genocide studies then, so in the late 90s, early 2000s, was an interest in colonial cases in the histories of Australia, where I come from the histories of the US and so forth. In the year 2000, I'd returned to Australia after 8 years of graduate work in the US and Germany to commence teaching at the University of Sydney. And I wanted to teach a class on genocide, but I found virtually no reading to set on the question of genocide in Australia. Of course, there was plenty of historical work on frontier violence, but none with the genocide frame. And as I learned from my Indigenous colleagues at Sydney University, the genocide frame was meaningful and significant for them. Note how the slogan of "No Pride in Genocide," if you can see on the right-hand side of that column, this is graffiti on colonial hero columns in downtown Sydney, is central to Indigenous politics. The other slogan is change the date of Australia Day to Invasion Day. But here's a mashup of various photographs of, it's called Invasion Day, which occurs on the same day as Australia Day, January. And No Pride in Genocide even makes it to the bus stops banners. So this is something that's very important to Indigenous politics. So I set out to fill this gap about the missing colonial aspect of genocide studies, running the first ever conference on genocide and colonialism in Sydney in 2003, and then publishing an anthology on genocide in Australia, that's the Red Book, in 2004, so 20 years ago. And then several years later, one on genocide and global history. Here, and I wasn't alone in this, of course, trying to effect a colonial turn in the field, along with other colleagues and newly minted PhDs. In this context, we discovered the writings of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish jurist who coined the concept of genocide in his book Access Rule in Occupied Europe in 1944. Already, the title has colonial connotations, occupation. There one could read in chapter 9, which is devoted to introducing this concept of genocide as a technique of occupation, that genocide was a mode of settler colonial domination He wrote on page 79, genocide has two phases. One, destruction of the national pattern of the oppressed group. The other, the imposition of the national pattern of the oppressor group. And this imposition, in turn, may be made upon the oppressed population, which is allowed to remain, or upon the territory alone after the removal of the population and the colonization by the oppressor's own national. A few pages later, he continued that updating the Hague Convention of 1899, which was his aim in this book, to protect national groups was necessary. And of that project of updating international law, to which this book was a contribution, he wrote, in the first step, we should be included every action infringing upon the life, liberty, health, corporal integrity, economic existence, and the honor of the inhabitants when committed because they belong to a national, religious, or racial group, and in the second, every policy aiming at the destruction or aggrandizement of one such group to the prejudice or detriment of another. Now, this is an extraordinarily broad definition of genocide that makes it tantamount to crippling, which is a term he used in many other writings. Like, crippling a nation was also genocide, not total extermination. On this rendering, genocide is a colonial mode of domination that tends to the crippling or destruction of groups. Now, in highlighting this dimension in Nazi occupation, based on resource extraction and the settling of its own German nationals in the place of Slavs and Jews, Lemkin was repeating a common analysis of observers in the early 1940s. Scholars and governments in exile, like the Polish government in exile in London and so forth, produced book after book detailing the effects of the Nazi occupation of their nations. And they understood the occupation to be destroying their nations, whether, say, Polish or Czechoslovak, or in this case, the Jewish people. Note how starvation is central to their conception of what was going on until 1943. Right? It's before the discovery of the camps in its, in the sense that we know today. Now, note from the table of contents of these books. This is the table of contents on the book on the bottom right-hand corner, The New Order in Poland, by Simon Siegel. You'll notice how mass murder is not even mentioned by 1942. The focus is on, well, there's massacres at the top, of course, and tortures, but the robbery of public property, economic exploitation, and what we would call cultural genocide today. Now, in those days, the struggle against the Polish spirit, not a term we would use today, obviously, is central to the conception of what the Nazis are doing. Here's another example. For the Czechoslovak version, this is also from their government in exile. You see a preface there by Edward Beneš. The invasion is the first sin, as it were, then is followed by Germanization, the persecution of Christian churches, the persecution of Jews, economic enslavement and robbery, the destruction of Czech schools, Czechoslovak cultural life, a version then in Slovakia, and then a section on resistance at the end. These lists also resemble the crimes, in part at least, of the Commission of Responsibility report that the Allies produced in 1919 to indict German and Ottoman authorities for violations of the laws and customs of war during the First World War. Note begins with murders and massacres, the death of hostages, torture, starvation, rape, abduction of girls for prostitution, deportation, internment, attempt to denationalize inhabitants. The technical term here means to strip away their sovereignty and to make them nationals of your own country, pillage, economic exploitation and the confiscation of property, what they call the wanton destruction of religious and other monuments. This is what in the other document is called the tax on the Polish spirit. Okay. This is much more legalistic document. But note like the others, how broad it is. Killing civilians is just one of many techniques of occupation, as it were. Although in this case, the Commission is not interested in nations, but in civilians, occupied civilians. And the civilians of the countries like Armenians within the Ottoman Empire. Now, the focus on nations came in the 1930s and 40s because the Nazis had made it clear that they were intent on conquering, subjugating and destroying the nations they had occupied, including the Polish and Czechoslovak ones. At least that is how very nationalistically minded exile scholars and state officials saw things. And they certainly saw the Nazi occupation as colonial, and they resented being treated like Africans. And this trope comes up again and again. Lemkin reflected this consensus in his definition of genocide as comprising distinct techniques of genocide. We would say policies today. As you can see, they cover the totality of national life, including what others refer to as spiritual aspects, believing as he did, like many at the time, that there were a national spirit, like the spirit of the Polish people. Accordingly, attacks on culture were genocidal when motivated by the intent to destroy, and coupled with attacks on physical or biological existence in the group. In another lecture, I'd go through each of these in detail, but we don't have time. Now, these themes, including the notion that the Nazis were treating Europeans as Europeans had been treating Africans, was taken up by Hannah Arendt in her Origins of Totalitarianism in 1951. It's already just a few years after the war. In fact, many of the essays that made its way into totalitarianism were published in the mid-1940s, and then she brought them all together. So very much in the tradition that Lemkin was working in. And of course in Césaire's Discourse on Colonialism, 1955. And this line of inquiry did indeed initiate a colonial turn in genocide studies as we recovered this tradition. As you can see from titles like this is Genocide on the Settler Frontiers by Mohammed Adhikari, who teaches at the University of Cape Town. It's in a series in Burkhan books that I edit on war and genocide, and a much more recent book on American settler colonialism, which has a fair bit on genocide. I'll just run through a couple of titles there in American historiography. Just in the last few years, you can see that genocide has become very much mainstream in the literature. And this is extraordinarily new. And in Canada as well. And then, finally, in Nazi historiography, Jochen, who's written a lot on German Southwest Africa, his second book was about the connections between that German occupation and the Nazi case. Mark Mazzau, who teaches at Columbia, drew on this literature as well in Hitler's Empire. And then much more recently, Rachel O'Sullivan, who's now based in Munich, I think did a PhD in Edinburgh with Donald Bloxham, who's originally from Ireland, has come out with a series of studies introducing the colonial turn back to genocide, so Holocaust studies. As you might expect, there'd be quite a bit of resistance to that by people who insist on the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and it's just a couple of examples. But the link between genocide and the Holocaust and colonialism can't be ignored despite this resistance, if only because leading historians like Christian Gerlach, who teaches in Bern in Switzerland, writes sentences like this and points out the obvious, like quoting, leading Nazi politicians and organizers of destruction linked the murder of Jews to the creation of a new order in Germany's Eastern Empire. As with the persecution of Jews, whoever considers the non-Jewish victims of German Axis violence in their entirety must also take account of imperialism. Some 300,000 to 350,000, some 300 to 350,000 of the 6 to 8 million non-Jewish killed were German. That is, 95% of foreigners were foreigners from the German point of view. Of the 6 million Jews slain, only about 165,000 were German citizens. That meaning 97% of the victims of the Holocaust were not German citizens. They were in other countries. In other words, the Nazis and their allies had to conquer foreign territory and murder Jews there in their violent project of expansionism. And yes, that's what we call imperialism. But that's something that many Holocaust scholars in Germany find difficult to grasp when they write books like this in this country as well. Now, around 2010, however, I began to see that this project of conceptual recovery to make the genocide concept a useful category for settler colonial studies and Holocaust studies may have reached its limits. Yes, a new field of settler colonial studies had been established, also driven by scholars in Australia, mind you. Here's this famous essay by Patrick Wolf, a landmark essay in Journal of Genocide Research, which we discussed as a draft over a meal in Melbourne in 2006. Fun fact, it's the most downloaded article in our journal, 500,000 since 2006. And this field is still going strong. But it became apparent to me from various experiences that popular, as opposed to scholarly recognition of indigenous genocides, was consistently mitigated by reference to the Holocaust. First Nations people may have suffered and been done an injustice, many were prepared to admit, but genocide, no. That's what the Nazis did, they said, and that's what the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a genocide, but really not much else, maybe Rwanda. I heard this a lot. So in teaching the subject and editing this journal of genocide, it became impossible to ignore how genocide has become a key word for our time. Genocide has been proclaimed in relation to Guatemala in the early 2000s in legal proceedings, referring to the early 80s, by the Tamils in Sri Lanka in 2009, to the Russian invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago, to the Rohingya case in Myanmar 2017, Uyghurs in China for the last 10 years or so, the civil war in the Ethiopian Tigray region, and many other cases. And of course, regarding Israel's destruction of Gaza. Here was, for example, a big event just a few weeks ago in Texas, featuring mainly Palestinian scholars on the question of genocide in Gaza. It's taken for granted as a fact, it's not a controversial claim in this context. Now, in all these cases, I've observed how Holocaust analogizing takes place. And I've wondered why and how this analogizing functions to exclude most of these cases from the genocide category when you reach the courts. Is that why it's so hard to prove that genocide has taken place, with this legal definition? If the Holocaust is unique, as commonly supposed, how are other events of mass civilian destruction supposed to measure up? After all of the many cases in the 20th century of mass violence, only a few are regularly regarded as genocide. You can count them on one hand, maybe with a few fingers on another hand. And what does that say about the rules of the game of recognition, which is genocide, which is not? Why is genocide, in fact, and I ask sort of more basic question, so central to these recognition campaigns when alternatives like war crimes and crimes against humanity are really no less heinous? The reason is that where people cannot see genocide, they are less shocked by mass violence against civilians. Because genocide, illegitimately in my view, but is regarded as the crime of crimes. This status, I think, inadvertently licenses non-genocidal civilian destruction by distinguishing between their driving logics. Genocide is caused by ideologies of hatred, in which racialized victims are targeted as such, as the UN Convention puts it, versus military targeting, in which civilians are killed collaterally, incidentally. That is, as side effects of attacking a military object. The former is stigmatized and criminalized as the crime of crimes, while the latter is usually, largely legal and quickly forgotten. So we're dealing with also, I think, with a quasi-theological category. Since the Holocaust, as the absolute genocide, has become a symbol for secular evil in this culture, it requires absolutely evil perpetrators and absolutely innocent victims. Hence the constant refrain about innocent women and children, although non-combatant men are also innocent. Given its stigmatic aura, the temptation of victim groups, that is, genocide stigmatic aura, the temptation of victim groups to cast their oppressors as in Nazi-like terms is difficult to resist, just as the attempt of states to disavow genocide is readily apparent. Think of the Turkish resistance to the claim of the Armenian genocide. Genocide is what the Nazis did, say Turkish leaders. Incidentally, Israeli leaders do the same, that is, they agree with the Turks, in that sense working hand in glove despite their otherwise great differences, as the historian Eldad Ben-Ahoen notes in many articles. We're also dealing with a basic distinction in international affairs and law between armed conflict and genocide, the former motivated, as I've said, by the imperative to defeat an enemy when the killing is supposed to stop, and the latter, genocide, by the intention to destroy an enemy as an end in itself. Let's not forget that armed conflict warfare is not illegal, according to the UN Charter if carried out in self-defense, as a just war. Self-preservation has been a prerogative of states since time immemorial. In the past, there were few limitations to state conduct when it felt its existence was imperiled. Now international law insists that just wars are waged justly, meaning that principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality are observed. If civilians are killed disproportionately in military targeting objectives, war crimes may be committed. If attacks on civilian populations are widespread or systematic, we're talking about crimes against humanity. But not genocide. That is reserved for the intention to destroy an ethnic or racial or religious group in whole or in part, as such as the definition puts it. Now this distinction, which was crystallized after the Second World War, stripped Lemkin's genocide concept of its anti-colonial dimensions. The Convention on the Punishment and Prevention of Genocide, I wanted to add, by the way, that research like this, we publish in the journal Genocide Research, shows that, this is from the abstract, genocide claims are used by all kinds of victimized groups in their self-determination drives. That's why he calls it genocide and self-determination drives. Very strict. He calls about genocide claims frequently proving to be the weapon of choice of relatively weak secessionist entities struggling to enhance their bargaining position and achieve international legal status. Eugene Finkel published a very similar article a few years before, especially in relation to the many genocides claimed in the immediate post-Soviet period when all these new nation states. Anyway, back to the Genocide Convention. Now this convention, passed by the UN General Assembly in late 48, I think did not mark some momentous humanitarian step forward as commonly supposed. For the states that thrashed out the convention designed it so that state sovereignty would not be compromised in pursuing their security interests. The convention criminalized only a very narrow and virtually impossible to prove modality of mass violence and elevated it to the crime of crimes, meaning that other modes of state violence, well, they weren't too bad. These states, after all, did not regard warfare itself as illegitimate. They had just defeated the Axis powers, destroyed their cities with fire and atomic bombs, and countenanced the forced expulsion of 12 million ethnic Germans from East Central Europe. The Cold War was beginning, and independence movements confronted the Western colonial empires reasserting their control in Asia and North Africa. For the war's victors, the sovereign rights of states to engage in international and non-international armed conflict required the rescue of military necessity from its discrediting by the Nazi mode of exterminatory warfare and occupation. Everyone understood, and during these Genocide Convention negotiations, that armed conflict impacted civilians dramatically. The official committee of experts' commentary on the draft convention, written in part by Lemkin, acknowledged that civilian populations were affected by modern warfare with, quote, more or less severe losses, unquote. So the committee distinguished between armed conflict and genocide by arguing that in the latter, in genocide, quote, one of the belligerents aims at exterminating the population of an enemy territory and systematically destroys what are not genuine military objectives, unquote. Military objectives, by contrast, aimed at imposing the victor's will on the loser, whose existence as such was not in peril. Killing mass of civilians was acceptable, if regrettable, when motivated by military goals. Victory, not destruction. Now, how did the UN Convention affect this distinction? First, I'll go back. First, it states that genocide means the intent of destroying whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, religious group as such, which is sort of towards the middle at the bottom of Article 2, the bottom of the first sentence. As such requires that victims are targeted solely on the grounds of their identity, for symbolic rather than material reasons like warfare. The states negotiating the Convention's definition deliberately modelled it on the Holocaust, understood as history's largest hate crime, to distinguish it from warfare and even population expulsions, including ethnic cleansing, which they'd after all countenanced just then. It excluded cultural genocide and political groups as a protected category, modelling genocide on what they thought the Holocaust represented. This definition ensured that a state could avoid committing genocide by claiming to act for political strategic purposes. Repressing political opposition and destroying entire peoples, or at least large numbers of them, in military action was now all the easier because the genocide threshold increasingly functioned to screen out military necessity and most permanent security practices. I mean, when you think of this list in relation to those earlier lists I showed you from the Commission of Responsibility with all the manifold crimes and those tables of contents from those reports about occupied Poland and Czechoslovakia, which included what we call cultural genocide. It's all been stripped out, and you're left basically with biological genocide in various modes. As a consequence, the wars waged ever since now, in which many millions have died, cannot be legally categorized as genocide. And as a consequence, we think more about the victims of genocide during World War II than the overall civilian casualties, a staggering 30 million. Now, this distinction between conflict and genocide, note its articulation in this banner at City College right now. That's an encampment at my university. I made a screenshot of a clip of it that I saw on the SJP's Instagram post. Was affected in the course of various controversies and conflicts since the 1950s. This distinction has two consequences. One, those who seek to have their case recognized as genocide need to cast it in Holocaust terms, name it as a drama of politically passive victims murdered solely on the grounds of their identity. We observe how in mobilizing or refuting the genocide accusation, both as a rhetorical and legal claim, actors routinely invoke Holocaust analogies to this end. Two, as mentioned already, insisting on genocide as the crime of crimes blinds us to much violence against civilians, which is effectively excused as collateral damage attendant to the operation of military necessity, the unintended consequences of attacking what are said to be military targets. The narrow construing of the genocide concept indeed allowed the legal killing of millions, and we need to confront the fact that that's how the law may play out in the Palestine case exactly on these terms now, when the ICJ eventually rules. Now, during the UN debates about the Genocide Convention in 47 and 48, state representatives understood that they were deliberating on the most stigmatized crime because it essentially codified what the recently defeated Nazis had been doing to Jews and Slavs, the mass murder of civilians of enemy nations. And this represented barbarism, while they, the war's victors, incarnated civilization, and they spoke explicitly in those terms. And for this reason, Israel and Arab nations, India and Pakistan, immediately invoked the term against one another in the partition violence of 1948. Well, here we go, that's a slide. At the same time, Baltic emigre leaders accused the Soviet Union of genocide for deporting and otherwise destroying their elites and national culture. So these are from 1947 and 48. And from the outset then, genocide was a powerful diplomatic trope to be hurled during the incipient Cold War. And genocide was so powerful because its archetype was the Holocaust of European Jewry, which many even then understood as representing the most significant extermination in world history. This much is clear reading the UN debates, which I've done. Now, the common denominator was the domestication of the genocide concept and then the Genocide Convention, as I've been arguing, so it would not threaten state sovereignty and its security discretion. Raison d'etat could not be constrained in a global order constituted by states, whether empire states like the Netherlands or Great Britain in putting down anti-colonial rebellions in the 40s and 50s, or new states like Nigeria and Pakistan in repressing separatist movements in the 60s and 70s. The last thing they wanted was Lemkin's broad definition, genocide with its anti-colonial, anti-statist potential. Now, this meaning was inaugurated in the convention in the late 40s, but it was thrashed out and sedimented later. What I show now is how, since then, genocide has become rendered as a massive hate crime model on the Holocaust. The non-political understanding of genocide as a sort of a hate crime with passive agents as victims has been sedimented through this period and is remarkably resilient, and we see it today. And the evidence demonstrates too that the actors routinely refer to the Holocaust when invoking genocide for their case. So let's start with a couple of case studies. Only 3 years after the UN Genocide Convention, it was put to the test by a controversial petition directed to the UN General Assembly by the Communist-backed Civil Rights Congress, founded in 1946, led by African-American lawyer William Patterson. Here is his autobiography, The Man Who Cried Genocide, so named because he led the petition with Paul Robeson, signed by luminaries like W.B. Du Bois, and accused the US of genocide against African Americans. Petition is really not the right word. It's 239 pages of closely reasoned and exhaustively documented detailed indictment of racial violence and discrimination in the US. Now, because Patterson was a lawyer and wanted to provoke international legal proceedings, he cleaved closely to the UN definition, organising the headings under Article 2 of the Convention with its 5 modes of destruction. Obviously, the lynchings and police violence featured centrally, as did the economic disadvantage of African Americans, which he claimed reduced their life expectancy by 8 years compared to whites. Now, this was all straightforward enough. The leftist rhetoric was quite discernible. It was written in this anti-imperialist style that you got in sort of Soviet literature at the time. But the empirics were very strong. The aim of segregating African American ghettos with poor housing, education, and medical care, he said, was the perpetuation of economic and political power by the few through the destruction of political protest by the many. He wrote, in keeping very much with Lemkin's original definition of genocide of 1944, in which discrimination and domination as part of a genocidal process are intrinsic. Now, as might be expected, the petition was denounced as communist propaganda, and Patterson was prevented from delivering the petition at the UN in Paris, where State Department officials attempted to confiscate his passport. To a large extent, the government succeeded in burying the petition, which hardly featured in the US press, apart from in the African American press, like in this case here. Now, our interest is directed to Lemkin's involvement. In a letter to the New York Times, he backtracked. He stuck to the narrow definition of genocide. And he said that genocide could not be taking place when African Americans were enjoying improved living conditions and in fact growing in number. What he called the fright occasioned by lynching was not tantamount to serious mental harm, which is in the convention. What is more, genocide was a rare crime of great magnitude, which he defined narrowly now as annihilation, by divorcing it from the Nazi politics of discrimination he had included in his earlier work. I quote him, "The tragically dramatic nature of genocide should not be permitted to be deflated. By confusing genocide with discrimination, injustice is done to those, not only to existing international law, but also to the good name of some democratic societies, which might be unjustly slandered the genocide. Sound very much like arguments you hear today. And again, defending his adopted home by so closely joining the Holocaust and genocide, he sealed the abandonment of what the Polish government in the 40s called the one long chain argument. That is, beginning with discrimination against Poles under Nazi regime, you ended up with mass murder. This was one long chain of destruction, which Lemkin effectively adopted in his definition of genocide. And he, of course, ignored African-American communist author, contributor to the petition, Oakley Johnson, who repeated Lemkin's own wartime argument back to him in a letter you can find in the New York Public Library archive branch in Harlem, and where Oakley argued in his letter to Lemkin, far from the Klan actions frightening individuals, they terrorized entire communities, and just as millions of Jews had survived the war, so surviving African Americans did not entail the absence of genocidal intent. And discrimination could not be counterposed to genocide, but was a factor in genocide. This is exactly what Lemkin had been arguing in the mid-40s, but now abandoned, because he wanted the US to ratify the Genocide Convention. Now, another important stage in our conceptual journey was a post-colonial episode, the secessionist Nigeria-Biafra war that raged between 1967 and 1970. The violence began in 1966 when coups and counter-coups led to the massacre of tens of thousands of Christian Igbo in northern Nigeria, which was a majority Muslim Hausa part of Nigeria. The surviving Igbos fled to their homeland to the south, and tense negotiations then between the different regions ensued, ultimately unsuccessful. And the Southwest regime announced its secession and established a new Republic of Biafra in July 1967. The war then raged until January 1970, when the federal military government prevailed and crushed the secession. And the conflict made headlines around the world, above all the major famine caused by the military government's blockade of Biafra in the country's east. Full details in this book that I edited there with Lasse Perkins, or his own book, you can see. Now, the crisis drove prominent academics and journalists, very similar to the mobilization around Palestine today and around Ukraine as well, to mobilize public opinion to stop genocide, and it prompted a major international relief operation to bring supplies to starving civilians. These groups comprise concerned civilians. Here you have Biafran diaspora in London, as well as celebrities. Here are civilians in Germany, along with celebrities and intellectuals. Those who are English among you will know this is a famous model and actor, Jean Shrimpton. There she is at Piccadilly Circus. You can see genocide is on the poster as the the traffic goes around in circles. They're called roundabouts where we come from. Here they're called circles. And intellectuals, actually, well, a whole lecture on this, so I'm just cutting this back. Churches were also quite central. You see Biafra down the bottom, Justice for Biafra. And here, the German students of Biafran students work from Frankfurt to Bonn, which is quite a long way, for liberation, for national liberation, self-determination, Biafra, along with the genocide rhetoric, very much in line with that academic article about the drives of self-determination struggles being accompanied by genocide as a legitimating strategy. Now, from the outset, the Biafran advocacy, propaganda, if you like, from the Igbos claimed that they were victims of genocide or an impending genocide, meaning they would be slaughtered if they lost the war, as they had been in these massacres in 1966. They called themselves the Jews of Africa, who'd suffered pogroms, and they were suffering a final solution. This pitch played out very differently in each country. Again, for details, see this book. In Germany, where Holocaust analogies abounded, this pitch worked very well. And it worked very well with the Israeli public as well. In the Knesset, the Israeli leadership was quite torn on this and ended up selling arms to both sides. Now, the Biafran leadership, there's a chapter on Israeli policy, by the way, in this book on the left. It goes into this in detail if you want, by an Israeli scholar, it has all the archives and so forth, if you're so inclined to follow that up. The Biafran leadership was fascinated by Israel not only as a victim nation, but one that had constructed a state after a genocide and then gone on to repel Muslim and Arab invaders as they saw Arabs in relation to the Hausa and Nigerians in the north in the same year, 1967. For this reason, they presented Biafra as in a similarly schizophrenic way, as hapless victims of racial violence, while also being a progressive nation that brought modernity to a backward and feudal part of the world. Now, Biafran claims placed enormous pressure on Western governments, and you have here, for example, opposition MPs making passion speeches, and you've had Oprah Ward, famous novelist, the son of the famous novelist as well, famous writer writing, criticizing British backing of the government. So very similar to the kind of pressure you see on governments today. Now, for all that, the Nigerian and British states ultimately won out, despite this kind of Holocaust imagery you see here. They orchestrated a UN observer report to visit Nigeria, constituted by Canadian, Polish, Swedish, and UK representatives, and some from the Organisation of African Union, most of whom opposed the Biafran secession. They couldn't get into Biafran territory, they stayed in Nigerian occupied territory. So they couldn't observe the famine and the aerial bombing. So it was a pretty highly curated, predictable report. They came out and said, there's no genocide taking place. And then international public opinion largely concurred. They concluded that the Nigerians were not Nazis and the Igbo were not white Jews. This was a civil war, not a genocide. Very much in the same framework as that poster at the City College, which says the opposite. This is a genocide, not a conflict. Why can't people think that it's both? I'm interested in this conceptual Manichaeism. Where did this come from? Now, the view of a Red Cross worker in 1969, French Red Cross worker, neatly encapsulates the view that genocide had to resemble the Holocaust to be legible. It's mostly when speaking about the victims of this war that we speak about genocide. Genocide, really? No, if it's used in the same sense of cold-blooded extermination executed by the Nazis. Yes, which is what the legal definition effectively is. Yes, if we look at the sequence of events, the particular circumstances of the blockade, perhaps the difficulties experienced through a lack of control of the troops or overzealous leaders or mercenaries, which would not be the legal definition of genocide. Okay. Now, this distinction ensured the exclusion of the Nigeria-Biafra war, in which millions of people died, millions, to put everything into perspective, from the field of Holocaust and genocide studies. Now, I actually have a whole section on East Pakistan. I'm going to leave it out, but I've got a lot of images for the end, because the images are important, including the press coverage. Vietnam. Now, all this is going on, of course, during the Vietnam War. Unlike the Biafra case, it was structured by a Cold War binary. The extent of US military violence shocked liberals and leftists. It's now forgotten that some of them accused the US of genocide. For example, his best-selling book, The Pursuit of Loneliness, the sociologist Philip Slater discerned what he called genocidal patterns of thought in the Vietnam War. Many other liberals made this point. Student activists and leftist intellectuals drew less on outraged liberal morality than on a long-standing critique of capitalist imperialism, while invoking outright parallels between the Holocaust and the American War in Vietnam. Here is some, from Cuba, and here you have the SDS talking about genocide in relation to the war. And here you have, okay, my slide, there we go, they're out of order. Here you have a special supplement of the Guardian newspaper, The American, which was the largest independent leftist weekly in the US at the time. It was close to the US Communist Party, and it talked about genocide predictably as well. Now, beyond slogans, the main intellectual vehicle for the genocide accusation was the unofficial International War Crimes Tribunal that met in 2 sessions in Sweden and Denmark in 1967, organised by the English philosopher Bertrand Russell, featuring well-known pacifists and leftists like African-American writer Stokely Carmichael, pictured here, always cigarettes in those days, always. The Russell Tribunal, as it was commonly called, utilised the continuing prestige of the Nuremberg indictment as a normative standard with which to condemn the US. The tribunal duly invoked the laws of war, listing its first complaint as aggressive warfare, like Nuremberg, and its fifth and final one with genocide. It asked, have forced labour camps been created? Has there been deportation of the population or other acts tending to the extermination of the population, and which can be characterised juridically as acts of genocide? The publicity surrounding the tribunal fixated on the genocide charge, in part because the French Marxist philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre addressed it in his presentation, then his separately published essay on genocide. Sartre made many telling points about permanent security. I actually don't have time to get into all the detail, but one of the major points was that in the Cold War confrontations outside Europe, you have the suppression of peasant nations which are engaged in people's wars, which were using guerrilla tactics. So the only way to put down such people's wars was exterminating an insurgent people. In effect, he said, genocide presents itself as the only possible reaction to the insurrection of a whole people against his oppressors. Of course, he's thinking of Vietnam. What's more, he said the American strategy intended to warn other national liberation movements in Latin America, so to make example of the Vietnamese, saying if you don't accept our Western-backed regime, submit or face extermination. So that's his quotation. Now, on this telling, the US empire entailed exterminatory violence against civilians until insurgents is submitted to US-backed governments. But did this capture the genocide logic? Now, the question turned on genocidal intent, and the same debate we're having today was had then, and it's remarkable how similar it is. I'm not getting into detail about the Sartre's arguments because we don't have time. What's important for us to understand is how the reviewers responded. One of them was this philosopher, Gómez-Delgado, who wrote in an academic article in 1973, typical argument of the time. Genocide is not just another crime, not even another war crime or crime against humanity. For many, it is the ultimate offence. Moreover, accusations of genocide in our time are coloured by the paradigm case, still very much within living memory, the treatment of the European Jews by other undesirables by the Nazi government until its defeat in 1945. The very term genocide entered our language as the designation of that Holocaust. Now, as a consequence, he continued, there is a strong temptation to assert that injuries that fail to measure up to the fury of the final solution, these are his words, the Nazis' design for the Jews, do not fit under the genocide rubric. So you can see that logical collapse. If it doesn't look like the Holocaust, it can't be genocide. The inevitable and familiar conclusion was that Jews were killed, quote, and I quote, not as a means to some further end, but simply for its own sake. So while the American tactics, he said, tended towards genocidal results, the requisite intent was missing. Now, of course, philosophers love these kind of guess, but so do lawyers at international courts. A hostile critic of Sartre was the German-born political scientist at the University of Massachusetts, Amos Günther Levy. He commenced his reply in this book in the same manner as Berdow. He wrote, the prototype of genocide which inspired the convention was, of course, Hitler's attempted extermination of the European Jews, designed to bring about the final solution. There could be no question of genocide, he said. The Vietnamese population was increasing, exactly as Lincoln had said about African Americans, and people say about the population of Palestine. So they say the population of Palestine is bigger than 1949, so ergo it can't be genocide. It's the same kind of reasoning you get for 17 years. So he continued to strike a partisan political blow by equating America with Nazi Germany in its campaign through the Vietnam with the Holocaust. Sorry, I'm going to move on, but that was Sartre. The legal defenders of the American war effort cleaved very closely to international law because it supported their case about the legitimacy of military necessity. The American So here are some more quotes here that you get from Levy. The bombing was no worse than in Korea, where it had, quote, leveled practically all major population centers. In North Korea, nearly 52 million dead. 2 million, to put things in perspective, right? And he said, well, we did it then. No one said it was genocide. He said at the bottom, there was much in the American military effort in Vietnam that was legal, but probably shouldn't have happened. While the American way of war was undoubtedly took the lives of many non-combatants, these casualties were never inflicted as a matter of policy. You hear that argument today. The shelling, he said, was lavish, but civilian casualties were an integral part of modern war and modern military technology. This could have been written by Michael Walzer. He gave an interview recently where he said basically this stuff, word for word. He said a ratio of 30,000 killed to 10,000 insurgents, he said, is a pretty good ratio in a recent interview, like a week or two ago. Now, the American neoconservative intellectual, I'm sure you'd love to see a picture of him, Norman Podhoretz, that's what he looked like in the 50s, it was like. But he ended up, editing Commentary magazine, and he made plain the political stakes in this book from 1982, why we were in Vietnam. He drew on Hannah Arendt's Origins of Totalitarianism to argue that the struggle against Nazism needed to be continued in the moral crusade against communism, as effectively the same enemy. Once it was the Nazis, now it was the communists. Of course, now, is he still tweeting? Now it's the Islamists. It's the same totalitarian enemy. And this means, in the 70s and 80s, containing communism in Vietnam, he said, was therefore on the same moral plane as going to war as Nazism had been. And given the great cause and imperative to save American lives, he argued, that was tolerable for Vietnamese civilian casualties to be applied in disproportionate power and violence. That was what he called the American way of war. Günter Levy concurred, for all but the pacifist, the decision is whether any particular military conflict is justified, therefore has to be made not on the basis of whether innocent civilians are likely to be killed, but in terms of a country's national interest, unquote. So once again, very familiar articles, arguments. Okay, now what do we make of this reasoning? If you press the distinction between military and genocidal violence, it makes, in a way, theoretical sense. That's why lawyers and philosophers love to talk about this. But it's nonsensical in practice. Civilians are effectively guilty by association with enemy combatants. Then we verge on the mental world of genocide. Entire peoples as enemies whose members are collectively guilty, or at least expendable. In that case, the de facto, if not de jure, hierarchy of international criminal law makes little sense. Commentators nonetheless typically insist that civilian destruction cannot be equated with genocide. Military violence is limited to defeating enemies, they say, even if killing civilians along the way, according to the doctrine of double effect, is permitted. However, this of course is a distinction without difference if one does not privilege the intention of states. After all, what does it matter to civilians in the moment if they are killed with a genocidal or military intent, especially if pursuing the military objective results in genocidal-like outcomes? Now, this pattern is observable in Gaza today. Does the Israeli assault on the Palestinians of the Gaza Strip constitute genocide, as everyone is asking? Now, the point of such claims is not only legal but strategic, as with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's urgent and moral, given the devastation we all know. I'm going to skip some paragraphs now to save some time. Now many are sick and tired of hearing from academics that things are complicated when things seem so simple. However, if you look at the reasoning of the ICJ, the matter of determining intent is actually quite complicated, and that's why I observe that until the South Africans filed their suit in the court in December, and then it was heard in January, orthodox blogs like Just Security and Opinion of Jurists, which is where the international lawyers do their thinking, had stuck to Geneva law, that is, the law of armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions. These lawyers and academics refer to almost exclusively to the possibility of only war crimes. This is now October, November, December. and the possibility that some of the disproportionate bombing might be a war crime. That's it. They never mentioned the word genocide. So that's for until January, there was a complete disconnect between the genocide studies community, which was talking about genocide, at least some of them, and of course the Palestine advocacy on the one hand, and these international lawyers like this on the other. And this disconnect was reflected in the ICJ hearings, at which South Africa set out the case for genocide, relying on the many incriminating statements by Israeli leaders, while in reply the Israeli law team stuck to the law of armed conflict and cast the Israeli campaign in terms of self-defense. And that's why international lawyers even now are tippy-toeing around, and commentators like Alex de Waal, who teaches Tufts, works on, an expert on famines, even in this recent Guardian article where he says that Gaza is the most intense starvation catastrophe in recent decades, never once in this article does he mention the word genocide, although it was a few weeks ago. Consider too this prize-winning article by Tom Tannenbaum about siege warfare, and this is before what's going on now, but even conceptually, and this is a 75-page article, mentions genocide just a handful of times, but he focuses on what he calls encirclement sieges, which are motivated by military goals, not by the goal of destruction. So he readily concedes that there can be genocidal sieges, but that's not what he's decided to work on. Though he's tweeting about it, so you can see him on the top right there, tweeting in a very well-informed and also very sympathetic, humanistic way. But this is the kind of reasoning that the international lawyers get into, and they're not really interested in the genocide concept. They agree, this is now articles of the Geneva Convention, acts of deprivation that cause severe starvation as a consequence are prohibited, etc., etc., etc. So a very technical, legal, this is actually from the additional protocols of the Geneva Conventions, right? But if you go back to the Geneva Conventions, here, which I've extracted the two articles on Steve, you'll see that if they're motivated by military necessity, it's not illegal to starve a population, shocking as that may seem. The prohibition of starvation as a method of warfare does not prohibit siege warfare as long as the purpose is to achieve a military objective and not to starve a civilian population. The bottom line, the prohibition on starvation as a method of warfare does not prohibit the imposition of a naval blockade as long as the purpose is to achieve a military objective and not to starve a population. So this hair splitting comes down to, this is international law. This comes down to the State Department, these hearings with the Supreme Speaker for the White House, where a journalist says, well, what about the attack on the hospital in Khan Yunis? And the Speaker says, there was no attack on the hospital in Khan Yunis. There was an attack on Hamas hiding in the hospital in Khan Yunis. Because he understands that technical, legal distinction has enormous consequences. But what's the outcome? The complete flattening of the hospital and many other hospitals in Gaza. Okay? And that's what I mean about this distinction without difference. Now, this mixture of intention in real life, apart from these spurious philosophical distinctions, is what we see in the recent revelation that the Israeli military is using AI technology called Lavender that identified 37,000 male targets in Gaza. I'm sure you all read the article of 972 now. The human operator spent 20 seconds per target to verify that they're male, but ipso facto for them, women can't be in Hamas. The settings of this technology allow 15 to 20 civilian deaths for a low-level target, which includes killing them with 2,000-pound dumb bombs that are flattening entire buildings with the occupants inside. Now, another related software is called Where's Daddy, which determines when the target, because they track their mobile phones, because do people realize that the Palestinian cell phone networks are the same as the Israeli ones? I mean, what currency do people use in Gaza and the West Bank?
Check, really.
Right. So it's all, the Israeli deep state has access to everyone's cell phones and knows where everyone goes. And when they enter the house, they then drop the bomb, meaning that entire buildings with the women and the children are killed along with them for the low-level target. Now, leaving aside the cavalier, that is imprecise manner in which these targets are determined, which we can talk about later, this practice puts paid to the stock defense that the high casualty rate is caused by human shields. Hamas hiding among the civilians. Because what's in fact happening is missile operators are waiting for the targets to enter a house so that they then kill them. They want to do that for various reasons. So they're actually calculating consciously high levels of civilian casualty. Now, these are very likely to be war crimes, but taken at scale, are we dealing with crimes against humanity, for which you require widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, or genocide? This blending of military and genocidal logic, because it is a kind of blending, they're not targeting those buildings to get the women and the children. They do want to get the Hamas operative, but for them it's most convenient when they're in the house. So they're not really killing the women and children by accident. They know we're doing it quite deliberately. So it's very mixed. Now this blending of logics and adjudicating this, whether this is a genocidal intention, is what the ICJ is doing right now. But it's going to take years for it to pass out in court. Certainly the Israelis and the Americans will argue that international law regards this practice of killing as entirely legal. The ICJ, and this is I'm not a lawyer, but I've talked to many internationals, may well agree, because it requires that the only construction of the facts must be that it's a genocidal intent, not one that's mixed with a military intent. Yet we see that in reality, from all these other cases, Biafra, Vietnam, East Pakistan, and there are many others, these intents are always mixed in practice. Military targeting along with civilian casualties is never really separated as it is in theory. Now allow me to conclude like this. If our premise is to distinguish non-combatants from military targets, then their intended or indiscriminate large-scale destruction as a matter of policy is obviously highly problematic, because it continues until victory. That is what we're witnessing in Gaza and Ukraine today. Now, according to this logic, although, according to this argument, Hamas's violence on the 7th of October was genocidal as it targeted Jews as such, I don't think that's right, but that's the argument. Whereas what Israel is doing is in legitimate self-defense, and it can continue to kill as many civilians incidentally until its military objective is achieved, even though that might be 30, 40, 50,000 times more the number of the initial genocidal assault. And the law does allow that. And that's the shocking thing about international law, if you can get away with it. From the usually associated with fascist regimes, especially Nazi warfare with their strategic ambitions, permanent warfare, as this kind of war on terror has become over the last 20 so years, is shared by all forms of permanent security. From the perspective of non-Europeans conquered, colonized, and exploited by Europeans since the 16th century, permanent warfare seems like an apt description of what they've endured. We also need to consider non-international armed conflicts, whether civil wars, internal repressions, internal upheavals associated with forced development, like the Chinese Great Leap Forward, that cost 45 million deaths. All told, they've accounted for far more civilian deaths than legally conscribed genocide. If we are interested in how to prevent civilian destruction, we need to direct our intention to the operation of what I call permanent security. And in doing so, we can see that the concept and law of genocide is actually a tool of permanent security. What then are we to make of the widespread view outside most of the West that Israel is committing genocide? Is it a misreading of the facts? Is it motivated by anti-Semitism or anti-Westernism? Is it motivated by disgust with Western hypocrisy? Is it a combination of thereof, as many allege? Or does it signaling the weakening of this distinction between military and genocidal logics? Recolonizing the genocide concept, going back to Lemkin's original perspective, would prevent these legal wriggling out mechanisms for state destruction of civilians by effectively equating it with permanent security. And I think that's the question. So I'm going to finish just with what I've been doing as a scholar and editor of the journal Genocide Research. I started a forum on the war in Gaza, starting with the first one early January with Martin Shaw. You can see it's had over 6,000 downloads, and then various other ones, once every couple of weeks. And we have 12 so far in total, and many more are on the way. These are essays between 3,000 and 7,000 that have basically bullied out of people, colleagues, tap them, Many, of course, have said no. I've even managed to get Didier Fassin at Princeton. And the last one is by one of our authors, one of our editors, Omar Makdoum, who teaches at the LSE. So these I've arranged to be free access, so you can get them without being in front of the paywall. And I commend them to you. I'm going to leave you now with an image from the cover of my book, which is taken from a Yemeni street artist called Murad Subay, and it's of a family killed in a Saudi airstrike with American ordnance in Sinai in 2015. And he painted the dead family, the murdered family, on the back of the wall. It's called Family Portrait. He added the raven to indicate what happened to them. And the purpose of this is to show these aren't victims of genocide, they're victims of armed conflict, but they're not accorded the recognition in international affairs as victims of genocide. So my plea is that these victims are accorded the same dignity and remembrance as classical victims of genocide, because I find this distinction extremely problematic. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. I assume there's going to be a lot of questions, but we have the roundtable starting at 4. So we'll take a few questions, maybe about 20 minutes of Q&A. Please keep your questions really brief. Okay, so we'll start with Nandita. And project, please project.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I really, really appreciated your pointing out to us that, well, I mean, before I say anything, I should say, of course, anything I say is prefaced by the absolute outrage at what is happening in Gaza and the support to end it immediately and permanently. But I really appreciate your point, which is the desire to delegitimize some mass killings comes at the expense of legitimizing other mass killings, right? And I think we need to come to terms with the fact that our world and the continuation of the world as it is organized is dependent on mass killings, one after another, right? So I think it, as obscene as it is to determine that some are illegitimate and others are legitimate, the entire structures are obscene, right? And I think that one of the key structures that seems embedded in the very concept of genocide is the structure of national sovereignty, right? I think it's not a coincidence that, the Genocide Convention comes at a moment when the world of imperial states is being rapidly replaced by a world of nation states, right? And the idea that, the fact that nations are produced through mass killings often, right? And I think that it's disturbing to imagine that somehow Sartre imagined that the Nuremberg trials would be the model in which subsequent trials about genocide should be held, because what was upheld at Nuremberg, as Mahmoud Mamdani has recently written about, what was upheld at Nuremberg was the idea of the nation, right? And what was condemned at Nuremberg were individual Nazis rather than the Nazi project of nation building, right? And so we just get one mass killing after another. So I'm just wondering, in light of your project of wanting to weaken the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate, and more precisely legal and illegal mass killings, how do you see us moving forward in the project of ending mass killings, period?
Maybe we take a few more questions. Yeah. Any more hands? Now is your opportunity. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for this tour de force. I want to, my question is mostly about the historical sociological aspect of genocide. And while yesterday Professor Sharma correctly criticized Patrick Wolf's logic of settler colonialism, I'm wondering here, because, well, of course, as you know, considering settler colonialism following him as a structure, not as an event, he then thinks that not all settler colonial projects have to have a genocide, and particularly he thinks about the case of South Africa. And this is because of the logic of exploitation. When as long as the natives or slaves or former slaves keep being useful for labor, there won't be a genocide, at least up to regarding those if natives and slaves are the same for him. And what's quite striking is that in the case of Palestine, Israel-Palestine, we see that 48 ethnic cleansing, destruction of cultural sites, and for displacement, and then the importation of Mizrahi as Sephardi populations that will cover for the labor. Once you have in 67 the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, we have a spatial sequestration of Palestinians. But now, late 90s to 2000, there's an intensification of violence against Palestinians because they might actually have lost their sociological function within the Israeli separate colonial state. Now there is an importation of Filipino, Thai, Nepalese, Indian, Sri Lankan immigrants, and therefore now there is a complete logic of elimination. Perhaps now that we see the genocide. Thank you.
Andreas?
Yes, this is just to clarify, and then a question, a simple question. To clarify, is that the idea to give up the concept and the fear of genocide because of this distinction between legitimate and non-legitimate mass killings? Or is it to keep it only for what it was intended with the Holocaust paradigm? So this is my first question. What exactly is your position? And in criminal law, I'm not a lawyer, but in criminal law, there is always a distinction based on intent. Imagine what it would have happened if we take intent from criminal law. It would have created a completely different understanding of, let's say, responsibility, accountability, because many acts have the same effects, but the intention matters. So in that case, the problem of responsibility, planning something, should not play a role in the way that we evaluate particular acts. Intention should play a role in attributing responsibility. In other words, it seems to me that your argument is predominantly consequentialist. Let's look at the outcomes rather than of what might lie behind, because many different acts with different intentions might have the same consequences. But there is the other side as well. So that's
That's the first round.
Okay, so thanks for those questions. The first one was about how do I propose to break out of this fatalistic dialectic where a world of nation states is proposed as the answer for world peace, but is actually dependent on gross amounts of violence for its establishment and maintenance. So I didn't give a summary of my book on which some of this is based. This book is part intellectual history, or genealogy of the genocide concept, which is what I do here to some extent. The other half is the solution. In that way, I can answer a question about what I put in instead of genocide. And the argument is that underlying all mass violence against civilians, where you have this massive destruction, is state or parastate, because there are groups wanting to become states, ambition or aspiration for permanent security. They want absolute safety for their group, which leads to a particular temporal structure of their policy. They're not looking just to confront immediate threats. They're trying to anticipate future threats. And they will therefore deport, kill, or assimilate entire population groups from which insurgents may have come in the past. That's why so many of these cases are secessionist or national liberation conflicts. And for example, in Myanmar, the military decided not only to lock up the Rohingya separatists, which do exist, but to deport virtually the entire population, so that there would never be a secession in the future, because they're trying to future-proof their border areas. The same with in Xinjiang, the policy there was not one of expulsion but incarceration to assimilate and denude the Uyghur population. And you go through case after case like that, where you can see that the attack on the civilian population is driven by a desire to ensure that from it can never emanate a future threat. So once you understand that, you can see it throughout world history. Kind of for me, the scales fell off my eyes. So rather than looking for in this legalistic way, which is very black and white, is it genocide or is it not? You're interested in looking at securitization processes and how they if you're interested in the genocide nexus, how they intersect with the racialization processes. Because genocide is an ethnic and racial concept. For me, that's also a problem because while states do securitize populations like that, often they don't. But once we have, they'll securitize a population group, for example, because it's communist or anti-communist, but it's not an ethnic category. So the Genocide Convention doesn't protect communists or anti-communists. I mean, ironically, in the Genocide Convention negotiations, the Soviets and the right-wing dictatorships in Latin America banded together to exclude political groups from the Genocide Convention as a protected category because they both wanted to be able to persecute communists in one society and anti-communists in the other. Right? It's like how cynical international relations is, right? But the Americans and the Brits wanted to keep it in. So in an ideal world, we'd get rid of the concept of genocide and replace it with permanent security. Because then of course states would say, we're not engaging in security, we're engaging in legitimacy. Not permanent security, but legitimate security. But then you're arguing about what they're actually doing. Where all that happens now is states say, we've put on a siege, lots of people are dying, like in Gaza, but it's a military target. And that's the end of the conversation legally. And, and this is extremely convenient for states. And it's not an accident because state parties negotiated these conventions, not humanitarian agencies. I mean, the ICRC hosts them, but they have to come, when they formulate the text, a lowest common denominator formulation, and it lets them all off the hook. And that's why, undergraduates are shocked when they think international laws as lofty humanitarian instrument for the betterment of the world, rather than a way for states to preserve their sovereignty with as little interference as possible, while maintaining the facade of humanitarian, humanistic uprightness. Right? So, but in reality, we're stuck with the Genocide Convention, and it's a key word of international relations and the self-understanding of groups. So my argument would be that we could get people to understand that the logic behind genocide is not one of apolitical, a depoliticized version of genocide, is killing as such, but it's always a political project, and then it's always linked to permanent security aspirations, and then it becomes less useless. But it's still a very ethnicized project. That's the problem. And to go back to your first question about nationalism, it's an extremely nationalistic project that it has paranoia, if you like, built into it. It's no accident that the white nationalist movement in this country talks about white genocide. And it says, migration is a genocidal policy because it's diluting the population, quote unquote, and so forth. I've had actually arguments with them online. They actually quote Lemkin. They go back to the early Lemkin with this multi-dimensional definition of genocide and say, white culture is being attacked here, white demography is being attacked there, and they use it in this very cynical way, but they believe it. I mean, you're dealing with a particular kind of paranoid subjectivity. So the genocide concept is, I think, very ambivalent in many ways. And if you scratch the surface of, say, those Polish nationalists or national figures who are writing those reports, one of them says that the effort to assimilate Polish citizens into the German Empire in the general government, with the Germans annexed in 1939, and to make them German citizens, was worse than mass killing because it, kind of amputated a section of the Polish body politic. This kind of language. I mean, this is patently absurd thinking, but that's a logical conclusion you can come to when you ontologize a nation before individuals. And Lemkin comes out of that world. And in a sense, the Genocide Convention freezes us into kind of a human cosmos, an ontology of the human cosmos, which is very tribal from the 1940s. And then we're kind of stuck with that. That's why the current negotiations at the UN for a convention on crimes against humanity, I think, will be an important corrective. Much easier to prove than widespread and systematic attack on the civilian population. We see that all the time. What's happening in the West Bank? That's, I think, a very well observed. Certainly the Kahanists who are running half the government have had this in mind for a long time. An ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, if not Gaza. I mean, the West Bank's really biblical territory, much more than Gaza. So that's always been an aspiration. And given the changes in the structure of the Israeli economy as well, so the large agricultural workforce isn't required like it was. And as you say, can be easily replaced by South Asian workers. So that's certainly a precondition for it. I'm sorry I missed the critique of Patrick's article in one of the other panels, but I would be interested to hear it. So I argued with him, in person about his very rigid structural analysis. But to be clear, he calls it the article "Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native" to avoid the word genocide. Elimination is a much broader concept. In fact, he uses it very similar to Goldhagen in his book on Hitler's willing executioners. He said there was an eliminationist culture of anti-Semitism in Germany which could take the form of assimilation, intermarriage, and Holocaust. Which of course is that concept is doing a lot of work in that case, right?
Okay, just two questions, and we'll have to end it there. Radhika and Vanessa. Gary, you have to ask in person.
Thanks, Dirk, for that very informative and careful talk. I'm wondering, given what you've told us, if genocide is having trouble becoming a concept, right? Because concepts, they have to have a measure of abstraction. They have to be able to be mobilized in various different contexts. And here it seems like it's just tethered to its Holocaust context, right? So it's kind of not becoming a concept, right? It's too close to the empirical. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And secondly, around, what you've been saying, like just technical readings of the law. Law is a deeply interpretive practice. So again, can we bring in politics into these so-called technical readings?
Okay, your second question might be better posed to a lawyer, but there's another question coming.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dirk, for this really crucial talk. I'm wondering, from a kind of political strategic perspective, knowing about all the problems with international law, and I think you raised this really clearly, that it's part of the aim is international securitization, and security is one of the main principles of the bourgeois order, right? And I think that's also why I'm wondering if your concept of permanent security would rather be, in abolition we make this distinction between security and safety, and I think that's a crucial distinction with regard of security also being a modality of domination and power. But my point is now more around the international law, genocide conventions, UN. I mean, you raised so many important points, particularly with the recharge genocide move, which showed, to me, so clearly, but many other cases, and also with regards to the role, for instance, of the UN in the occupation of Haiti and what have you. So I'm really wondering, is it even like strategically a route to take in this moment with regards to moving into the realm of international law? Like, I'm really torn by this because I do understand that some organizers and even critical lawyers would say you need the strategic law process to mobilize people, but sometimes I'm wondering if it takes so much energy also, because we know the problems with international law, right?
Yeah.
And what kind of mechanism it is. So I'm wondering, what's your kind of take on, are these strategic legal processes that are fought in the terrain of struggle to culminate and mobilize counterpower? Or is it completely lost, because I actually think, and that's since a long time already.
Yeah, that. You think for a long time that.
Well, to me, when I mean, I'm not an expert on genocide, but
Yeah.
to me, when I engaged with the research genocide
Yeah.
move, and then also, you know, with regards to the whole kind of history of international law, how it's implicated in the bourgeois
Right.
order of securitization. Why do you even turn to that
Why even turn to it?
mechanism?
Yeah, yeah. No, it's fascinating to see how in all these cases, and I mean, it's pretty obvious that I'm putting the Palestine question today in this deeper historical context of similar kinds of national liberation struggles, slightly different contexts and scales, but the patterns of national liberation, self-determination, occupation, there are some similarity. And noting how, in all cases, genocide is alleged as a rhetorical and a legal claim, although you didn't have an ICC in those days, right? But people, like in the We Charge Genocide pamphlet, they quote the Genocide Convention. So what I'm seeing there is the manifestation of a dilemma for these groups, because the symbolic field has been, and the rules of the game have been preset, and if they don't talk about genocide, then you don't get a hearing. So you'll kind of have to sort of play the genocide card if there are certain criteria like mass killing and so forth, like the Tamil case, right? How many people talk about what happened with the Tamils in Sri Lanka in 2009? It's really utterly forgotten. But if you talk to Tamils, of course, they haven't forgotten. Many in Australia, many have fled or left to Australia. In fact, most Sri Lankans in Australia are probably Tamil. And likewise in East Pakistan, I'm going through this on the slides here to show you how public this was in 1971. That's in the Sunday Times, right? And then in the New York Times, you've got Kennedy talking about genocide. And in fact, there's much more adoption of the genocide rhetoric by senior politicians than you have today in relation to the Palestine case. So, and even then, made no impact on US policy. Okay. So in a sense, this talk is also a warning about that the outcome isn't what you may hope for. And I didn't put this in the slide, but look at the success Armenians have had in the recognition of the genocide campaign, genocide concept. Did that help them one iota in Azerbaijan a few months ago? Not one, because the US, especially Europe, oil interests were in Azerbaijan. Now that they don't get their oil from, and so forth, it's gas from Russia. Okay, Azerbaijan is an important energy producer, and they were thrown. Not that I supported everything what's going on in Nagorno-Karabakh, on the contrary, but the fact that there was this Western sympathy, public sympathy, and even public recognition by Biden now of genocide in 1915, has no bearing when it comes to the real political calculations of states. So the other problem with the genocide recognition game is that it's a yes or no answer. There's no murder one, murder two like you did in US and American law. So, and given that the threshold is set so high by the ICJ based on this Holocaust archetype, which you mentioned in your first question there, the chances of failure, like in all these cases, right, despite the fact that millions of people were killed, many more than what's happening in recent conflicts, right, is extremely high. And then you have the fate of possible mnemonic obscurity or oblivion. And what this points us to is that what matters is winning state power. And that's what the Bangladeshis won in 1979 at the end, and 71 at the end of the war, the year, because India invaded. Okay? Insurgents very rarely, if ever, actually defeat the state. It's only when there's outside powers. The preoccupation with Algeria in Palestinian circles is interesting. But closer reading of that case will show the intense diplomatic pressure on Algeria by US and European interests to pretty nudge them. But the insurgency did exhaust the threat, and that is important, an important background. But that's really an exception that proves the rule. These other cases, like Biafra, where there's just an abject defeat, and several million people dying, mainly of starvation, and it's accepted by the world as not genocidal, is the norm. Now, sensibilities may have changed since the late 60s. You didn't have an ICC then, now the ICJ is involved in these cases, as it wasn't in the late 60s. So, but as I stressed at the outset, I'm not here to tell anyone what to do or not to do. I'm just a humble, missive historian / international relations scholar, saying this is what I found in the archives and in the course of my reading might be something worth considering. The game of genocide recognition is stacked against victims, as I said at the introduction. The Genocide Convention, the decolonization of the genocide concept, or the decoloniality, I'm not sure what the verb would be, but the way it's the anti-colonial potential of genocide was stripped from Lemkin's definition, and then by Lemkin himself after 1948, makes the crime in its legal articulation extremely convenient for states. And international law, as has developed since then, is, as you acknowledge, is backing that. I mean, I think if Nora Erekat was here, she wrote a recent book to this effect. Victim groups need to use the law strategically without any illusions. And I think that's what's happening. I mean, Palestinians are desperate, they'll pull any lever, and of course there are different parts of the Palestinian movement. One route of the PA is diplomatic recognition, getting Palestine recognized as a state in the UN and as a party to these UN treaties, and including the ICC. I mean, that does sow panic in Israeli circles. And there's rumors abounding now that the ICC may be issuing arrest warrants for crimes against humanity for some leading Israeli scholars. These are just rumors in the newspaper, we don't know if they're true. But so it does matter. But it won't be something that, it won't be because of Israeli or Palestinian advocacy. This will be a decision made by the prosecutor at the ICC, who's actually very much on the Western sway. So it's a very complex set of moving parts in international society, and victim groups are usually the most impotent part of that moving ensemble.
All right, so thank you, Dirk.
Thank you.